Okay, so this week we're going to be talking a little bit about human rights. So what are human rights? I think the notion of human rights is actually really hard to pin down. There's no real overall agreement on just what a human right is. They aren't quite legal rights as we know them, nor are they moral rights as we usually understand those. So what are legal rights? Well, legal rights are the rights contained in law books or judicial decisions that a state will regularly enforce. This conception of rights is closely tied to both law, and writing especially, and enforcement. And it's mostly descriptive. That is to say, if we want to know what a right is, we just have to go out there and look in the world to see what's A, in the law books, and B, what actually is enforced and practiced. Human rights are really not like legal rights, because although human rights are elaborated by jurists, they're ratified by the UN General Assembly, and they're interpreted by international courts of law, they often remain unenforced. There's no international mechanism of rights enforcement. If human rights really existed as legal rights, then the claims they make would be enforceable against states that failed to respect them. And of course, what we see is a failure of enforcement in the case of many states in the world that do not respect human rights. So, as much as other states, as well as non-governmental organizations, might complain about human rights violations to one another, and very occasionally might put pressure on each other, at the end of the day, very rarely is any state held to account for human rights violations. Right, legal rights are supposed to not only help describe actions, but also constitute a trigger or a line in the sand, which, if crossed, triggers a law enforcement action. A rights violation is serious because it signals that force is potentially permissible to punish the violator. So declaring something as a human right is a way of triggering an enforcement procedure. Moral rights function somewhat differently. Moral rights are the rights or systems of rights articulated by moral and political philosophers. They aim to be moral standards against which we judge legal rights and the performance of states. They aim to guide actions, like lawmaking, for example, and give advice to people on how they should treat one another. In that sense, they're not descriptive, but they're normative. In order to find out what a moral right is, we can't just go look in the world and see what's enforced. We have to in some sense, do some philosophy and figure out what states ought to defend, right? We have to examine values. So the moral force and persuasiveness of moral rights comes from their logical coherence with one another, their capacity to move or bind the conscience of moral agents, the fact that they're capable of motivating behavior. Moral rights, therefore, again, are entirely normative. So human rights are clearly not like moral rights either. Human rights are usually the outcomes of bargaining between states. They're the product of long-standing practices of reciprocity between states, and they're the product of judicial decisions at the international level. They're not the output of rigorous philosophical inquiry. Human rights aren't necessarily logically coherent with one another, and they don't have to be in some sense in order to count as a human right. Because they are the products of political compromise, they don't always have much support in some countries and do not always act on the consciences of those they are aimed at. Indeed, human rights tend to be fairly broad and vague, and the reason for that is that they often want to claim the allegiance of people with very different ethical backgrounds and assumptions, right? People coming from very different parts of the world with very different philosophical and ethical background. So, for instance, they need to be able to appeal to the religious convictions of a broad swath of the world's major religions, and that limits how specific they can really get. So, theorists of rights in general often fall into one of two camps. They see rights either as markers of choices or as markers of interests. So if we look at rights as choices, the point of rights on this view is to signal who the choice maker is. The rights bearer is the one with the choice on the matter. For example, a right to free speech means that individuals get to choose whether to speak or not and what to say, not others. In that sense, the right tells us who gets to pick, right? So if we look at the right to vote, or we look at the right to remain silent, again, self-incrimination, If we look at a lot of the rights that we have, they seem to function as markers of choice. They indicate who gets to choose, and therefore, by extension, who doesn't get to choose. However, not all plausible rights, not all things we seem to think of as rights count as choices. So, for instance, the function of a right to a fair trial is presumably not to establish a defendant's right to have a choice about whether her trial will be fair or not. The rights as interests view says that the function of rights is to signal really important interests that people have. So the right to free speech and the right to a fair trial are both there to signal that their absence will be very detrimental to the interests of the putative rights bearer. When we want to know what a right is, we simply have to look at what fundamental human interests are, and then we can see what counts as a right. Of course, if rights are simply important interests, they don't do as good a job at telling us whose decision is to be respected in any given case. Interests also don't seem to have the gravity required for genuine rights. If something is right, then it seems like I should get it. It's mine by right. It's not yours. But if something is just an important interest, it's not so clear that I should get it. Maybe other interests could supersede mine. After all, there's always more important interests than individual interests. No matter how central the individual interest, the interest of others will often override the central interest of an individual. And so rights as interest gets us into often a set of conflicts about whose interests are more important or how to balance different human interests, whereas rights as choices are somewhat more clear-cut, even if they're unsatisfying when giving an account of various specific rights that are still thought to exist. So it seems pretty clear to me that human rights at the international level functions to signal important individual or communal interests that states ought to respect or promote. However, I think it would be fair to say that these rights, except where they're found in treaties or contracts, are mostly aspirational. So, for example, if we look at Article 25 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights of 1947, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. Now, when you look at this long list of rights, it's just not going to be the case that rights such as these are going to be able to be guaranteed, especially in the poorest countries. So how can we hold these as legal rights or as binding on states when there's really no hope of many states being able to enforce them or make them real? A better way to look at it is just to say that these are important goals that states have accepted as trying to fulfill, but for many states around the world, and even fairly wealthy states, completely vindicating these rights remains somewhat aspirational. Furthermore, there is no question that these kinds of rights are going to trigger any kind of legal actions, right? So, in the United States, if your various constitutional rights are violated, that enables someone, either yourself or the state, to bring a suit against whoever is going to, whoever has been accused of violating your rights. That's just not the case here. It's not the case that if someone is unemployed or sick or disabled and is not getting social support from their government, that any kind of legal procedure is going to be triggered to somehow get the resources unblocked and given to them. That's not how human rights work, or at least some human rights. So, given all of this, can we say anything at all about human rights? Well, I think we can say something about their general features. We know that they're norms. So we know that they are standards of conduct, in some sense, at the international level. Not at the national level so much, but at the international level. They're primarily directed at states as a result. They come in lists, right? There's not one human right. There's many human rights. Human rights are aimed to be universal. They aim to encompass all states and all peoples, although not all states have signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example. We also know that rights come with high priority, whatever that means. They're more urgent than other kinds of interests. So they're high priority interest, although how high and what that means is unclear and probably differs from one view to another. So beyond these four things, there is considerable disagreement about what a human right is, and I've tried to outline that. There's disagreements about their nature. So what makes human rights the same or different from other kinds of rights, and I've already started talking about that a little bit in this lecture. There's disagreement about foundations. So what considerations, if any, speak in favor of their existence? There's disagreements about their content. So what counts or ought to count as a human right? So we can ask, is the right to a decent standard of living really a human right? The stuff we just saw in Article 25, is that a real human right? Or is it possible for the UN Declaration of Human Rights to be mistaken? And of course, depending on whether you take a descriptive or a normative view of rights, you're going to have a very different analysis of that question. And I think in both cases you could disagree, right? A descriptive view could say, well, Article 25 may well be in the law books, but since it's never enforced and it never triggers any legal action, Article 25 isn't a genuine human right. Or it's possible to say Article 25 is a genuine human right. Look, it is in fact in the law books and ought to trigger enforcement. The fact that it fails to trigger enforcement doesn't count against it being a human right. On the normative side, of course, we can argue about whether a right to a standard of living is really a human right. The choice-based aspects of rights are going to generally disagree. The interest-based account of human rights is generally going to agree with that statement. So, yeah, lots of disagreement about their content, and that's true on both sides of the descriptive-normative divide. There's also a disagreement about methods. How do we identify what counts as a human right? Do we look at law books? Do we look at what states actually do? Do we need philosophical theory to tell us? So there's disagreements about just how to go about thinking about human rights more generally. And I guess this comes out from this lecture. So, conclusion. Well, it's safe to say that human rights mean different things to different audiences. Some would like human rights to guide the actions of states towards more humane goal. They would like the human rights to function like moral rights, guiding the actions of states. Others would like human rights to serve as a legal standard for sanctioning a state or interfering with its sovereignty. And that can go all the way up to humanitarian intervention to protect really important human rights and to stop really important human rights violations. And some parts of UN activity have in fact gone this way recently, right? When it comes to genocide or war crimes or other kinds of really important human rights violations, there has been a move towards allowing that to trigger international intervention. But note, this is a permission of enforcement. It's not a requirement. Right? So even in the case of genocide, all that means is that the international community is permitted to intervene and infringe on sovereignty as a matter of international law. Whether it actually will, of course, is highly debatable and really highly contingent upon which country is in fact perpetrating the human rights and whether anybody is willing and able at that moment in time to go and perform the rescue that are necessary. So, yeah. That being said, there are those in the international community, many in fact, who want human rights to have more teeth than they currently do. And by that I mean they need to have more enforcement capacity behind them. And that's not just true for things really, really important human rights like protections from genocide, but other human rights more generally. So for instance, they want to see, countries that don't provide worker rights, for example, to come under some sort of international sanction, maybe trade sanctions or something like that. Okay, and finally, there's others who would prefer something much less ambitious than the above options, right? For them, human rights are there to codify the standards and goals that states do in fact accept, but not to act as constraints on their sovereignty. So we can have a conversation about what ought to be a human right, but at the end of the day, what human rights are just the standards and goals that states do in fact accept. And how do we know whether we accept them? Well, we have to go look at practice. We have to go look at the practice of human rights and how, in fact, all of this plays out in international politics. But what human rights aren't, in fact, really going to do is act very much as constraints on the sovereignty of states, except as far as states accept to have their sovereignty constrained. Okay, so I hope all of that was at least somewhat informative. I confess that human rights to me are still a little bit perplexing because there are just so many different kinds of understandings and views on the subject of human rights. But again, I hope that there's at least somewhat of a clear idea of what's going on in the human rights world.